Is society producing more narcissists, or are more people susceptible to the abuse of narcissism? How has narcissism evolved in our internet age? What is going on here, and what can the church do about it? This is the Attaching to God podcast. Welcome back. My name is Jeff Holsclaw, and we're exploring a neuroscience-informed spiritual formation. And today we have back with us Dr. Chuck DeGroat. Thank you for being with us. Let me do the introduction before you chime in. He is the professor of counseling and Christian spirituality and the executive director of the clinical mental health counseling program at Western Theological Seminary, which is in Holland, Michigan. He is a licensed and practicing therapist, spiritual director, and author of a bunch of great books. We interviewed him about his newest one, Healing Within, but today we're going to kind of revisit an older work, which is called When Narcissism Comes to Church, Healing Your Community from Emotional and Spiritual Abuse. Chuck, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, I know I threw something out online, which was basically that question that I opened with, which was something like, is our culture producing more narcissists, or are we producing more people susceptible to being harmed by narcissists?
Yeah.
And then I got a bunch of comments. And then you jumped on and said, we should do a podcast about that, of which I will always say, okay.
Yeah.
So here we are.
I
So
know.
we're doing a podcast about it. And you've kind of been, you're starting a new book project, I think, or some other projects. And you've been revisiting your old work as well as other things.
Yeah.
So you've kind of been putting some thoughts in order. But before we go down, we're recording this just a couple of days after Easter. So we have to start with the hopeful, joyous resurrection movement. So before we get into the what's going on still problem, let's talk about some hopeful developments. What are some of the hopeful developments maybe in the last 5-6 years that you see in this conversation about narcissism?
Yeah. I mean, I think so often when this comes up, it just feels heavy, right? And people do, I think, experience, perhaps those of us who talk about these things as maybe critics of the church. But I'm always really eager to tell hopeful stories, not just of stories of particular people who I've worked with who've done really good work, but I think larger stories of how, for instance, denominations and networks have engaged me and others in trainings, conversations around these things, around awareness and accountability. I think the number of folks engaged in this area, the number of resources coming out has only grown. The number of pastors and therapists who are much more attuned to this conversation and who will write to me and maybe write to you and others asking how they might grow in character and show up with more humility in their work in the church. Those are all good conversations. I've had good conversations with church planning networks who are rethinking models of training and preparation and assessment of church planters. And those are really helpful because I think by and large, the kinds of assessments that we've done of church planters have contributed to we may bred some narcissists for church planting along the way. And so, I think the combination of the conversations, the trainings, the kind of therapeutic work, practitioners who are growing in their understanding, pastors who are working toward more narcissism aware and trauma aware churches and church staffs. All that is, I think, immensely helpful. And I think the fruit of some of the work that's been done over the last number of years with the writing and the resources that have come out.
So really quick about the assessment, because I get that sometimes, the question of like, well, how do we root out these applicants from churches? I was talking with some Mennonites and they're like, we just promote from within, which can have its own problems too. But there is a sense, if a community has known someone for 10 plus years in a close quarters, you can kind of be like, bad apple. But so is there, just real briefly, because that could be a whole nother. But like, are these assessments catching up? Or is there a way for, whether it's mission agencies, church planters, church staffing, is this kind of getting into the assessment?
Yeah, I honestly, I wish I had more time to do a deep dive into newer assessments. I think some of the older assessments that I began working with 20, 25 years ago now, practically, well, drew narcissists into church planting. I mean, if you would have looked at the assessments
Mhm.
and the kinds of questions that they asked, it seemed like that it was priming the pump for narcissists to step into.
We're, like, selecting in narcissists
Yeah.
instead of selecting them out? Yeah.
I mean,
Oh,
there's a
no.
whole in my old denominational space, in particular, a particular region where church planting was happening a lot. I mean, there were a string of narcissistic church planters and of flame outs and
Mhm.
really problematic, painful, hurtful, harmful behavior among these pastors that all gone through similar assessment processes. And that's what really got me thinking about this really more than 20 years ago now. But I can't really speak to it because I haven't done a deep dive into new assessments. What I can say is that a number of folks from different denominations and networks have been in conversation around this and have said, "Hey, we're going to go back and we're going to revisit that." I think it's really hard
Good.
because people often ask me, "Can you do an assessment and catch a narcissist?" And I often say that narcissism evolves. I'll do an assessment, and I have done assessments on, let's say, men in particular who've gone into church planting where they've successfully gone through an assessment process. And I'm talking about using some psychological testing and narrative-based testing and interviews and things like that. But once they got into ministry, once they gained some power and platform, what ended up happening is they became more and more anxious, more and more self-protective,
Mhm.
and narcissism sort of evolved in the context of ministry. And so, you
Right.
know, I can't really say that we can catch people on the front end because we do see this evolve in the context of ministry and when there's power to protect.
Yeah. Well, I know at the end, I will talk about, well, how do we create kind of communities of resilience and repair
Yeah.
and resistance to narcissists? But before that, let's go back then. So, how did you, let's kind of do just a brief backstory then. How did you kind of, end up writing this book, When Narcissism Comes to Church? Uh,
Yeah.
that goes back to some of your life as well as studying, like you said, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to really the late 1990s, when I was involved in a couple of different really painful situations, both in my seminary and in a presbytery that I was in, and in the church that I was serving in. And I was looking for resources back in the late 90s. In fact, there was a Dutch book that was translated on emotional abuse, and I was doing a lot of work translating uh, emotional abuse into spiritual abuse. There are very few resources back then,
Mm,
uh, and so I was sort of learning this on the fly, and it really came through the accumulation of experience, being involved in. I was a pastor and a therapist back then, working with clients, being involved in church planning assessment, being asked over time. I mean, I was young back then, but over time, as I grew in this work, being asked to speak more broadly to issues of church health, which I began doing, and then being asked to do some consulting, which led to some consulting work that I did about maybe ten years ago or so. It was in that particular situation that a group of people said, "Hey, if there's any way that you can translate some of what you've shared with us into a book, that would be helpful."
mhm.
And my immediate answer was no. There's no way I'd want to write a book on narcissism in the church. And what's funny about it is, I remember talking to a publisher about it, and his eyes got wide open, right? Like I probably pitched 12 other ideas, and he was falling asleep. But then I pitched the narcissism idea. And
Something like wholeheartedness in
I know,
scripture and
right?
Saint Avila,
Yeah,
Saint Teresa
yeah.
of
I've
Avila
got
and
this
Saint
really
John of
good
the
book on
Cross.
a 16th century woman who's a reformer in the church, and he's falling asleep. And then I say, but I could probably produce a book on narcissism. I know that stuff pretty well. Yeah, let's do that. So that's how it came about.
Uh,
Yeah.
all right. Well, so you did a lot of work. You wrote that book that came out. Did that come out in 2019 or 2010? 20
2020, it came
2020.
out
That's I
literally
meant
as
2020.
as shutdowns were happening.
Oh, that's
Came
right.
out as Amazon was shutting down their book sales to prioritize other stuff.
Oh my gosh.
during COVID. Yeah.
Well, so in those even short 5 years, you've kind of noticed an evolution of
Uh,
some of these things, and so you were just kind of pondering them and writing them. So you came up, I think, with five. So let's kind of go through some of those, and that'll help kind of fill out this idea of, well, what is narcissism? How does it function? Because I know
yeah.
some people are like, that's what I'm here for. So the first one, you talk about how narcissism has shifted a little bit from being authority based to algorithm based. What do you like? What have you been seeing? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So what I mean by that is that narcissism, like I think traditionally emerged out of places of power and authority within institutions, among people with titles and roles and degrees and more. And now I think part of the shift is that there's an assumed authority that comes with platform. So if you, like, for instance, if you're on Instagram and you've got 50,000 followers and you're talking about neuroscience, for instance, right? You may not have a degree in neuroscience, uh, background in it. But if you're talking about it, there's sort of this assumption that because people follow you, you are an authority on this. And I think what's happening there is that, well, positively, I mean, more and more people are having a voice that wouldn't have had a voice. So there's something beautiful and helpful about that. Not just traditional figures of authority, but others who do have something worthwhile to share. I think negatively, there is this sense that, if a therapist has 50,000 followers, she must know what she's talking about. Or if a
Mhm.
pastor has a big platform, that's got to be someone that I can trust. And
Mhm.
I just think that's a problem. Uh, and so uh, this is part of what's inspired writing on character formation, right? Because I do think we'll talk about this in a moment as we get to the second piece of this too, the second evolution of narcissism. But I do think that this shift to platform and visibility and rhetorical dominance as the new markers of authority sort of eclipse real wisdom and character that are embodied in relationship, as we know from a sort of a neuroscientific point of view.
Mm. Yeah, so and it feels like then in this moment, and this is not that new, um, but with the internet, with social media, and TikTok or all these things, Instagram, that there is an ability to have a platform that doesn't have just about any oversight, any like embodied
Uh,
relational
right.
connections. Maybe you can create a board who you're accountable to, kind of, right?
Mhm.
But you have no like local church. You don't have the old lady who's always grumpy at your sermon. You don't
Yeah,
have
not,
like the guy that's always very concerned about the
uh,
maintenance of the building, which are, there it's just a different reality. And so
yeah.
it seems, and going into the character question, it just seems like people like I've heard stories of people, who can be uh, you know basically they're influencers, entertainers, who are kind of speaking about church hurt or something like that, who can grow in major influence, get a bunch of funding,
Mm.
but there's very little accountability, there's very little
Yeah.
and then character. And so yeah, it's a whole new, it's just like gasoline for narcissists. Is that right?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And it's I mean, I think in some cases it starts out well intentioned. But I think just as in the case of traditional narcissism, you think of a pastor who grows in his platform, the church gets bigger and bigger, pastor becomes more and more anxious and thus more and more self-protective. So such such is the case with growth in numbers on platforms as
Right.
well, right? And it's fascinating to me, how many people talk as experts on particular things, or maybe even call themselves experts, um, or who are able to curate platforms that are really stylish,
Mhm.
or writings with a kind of rhetorical punch, uh, but without much training. And how there is this just default sense that if you have 25, 50,000 followers, 75,000 followers, you just must know what you're talking about. If you write a best-selling book, you must know what you're talking
Mhm.
about. And so
Yeah.
that's just something for us to pay attention to. We have to ask ourselves, who do I trust?
Yeah.
How might I better steward my sense of trust so that I can be formed well? I mean, I think about my early formation. It was just a few people. And now, we're immersed. We wake up every morning, we open ourselves into this portal of we might scroll through 100 different people with 100 different ideas. We're pulled in all these different directions. We're being
Mhm.
formed in particular ways, even in and through our engagement with social media. So we just have to ask some pointed questions of ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I think for all of us who are listening or watching this who are part of the scrolling classes, asking ourselves, well, who do we receive like spiritual influence from?
Uh,
And why is it coming primarily through our phone? And is that a good thing?
yeah,
And being a little bit more discerning,
yeah,
rather than someone else shared who said this is good, who
right.
has a big following. Because it's easy to just look at the following, look at the impact, and assume that there's character or real wisdom behind those things
That's
when
right.
there's not. I will just throw out a caveat that this is not just a church problem,
Yeah.
that if you follow like wellness experts, dare I say even therapists
Hmm.
who become big and blow up, who are
Yeah.
young, who just have a good little shtick, you like we don't know what their training is like or what their home life is like, and all this stuff. All
Right.
right, so the next one that you talk about is a
Yeah.
move from like a hidden narcissism to a performative narcissism. So what is that about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty closely related. Again, I mean, I think traditional narcissism operated a bit more behind the scenes, looked a little bit more like ladder climbing and power grabbing and institutional building. But now, again, in our social media age, we're rewarded for a kind of what I call performative narcissism. And I talked a little bit about this in When Narcissism Comes to Church, in the language of vulnerability, not vulnerability, but FAUX, vulnerability. Leaders and influencers strategically sharing personal struggles to appear humble while still maintaining control of the narrative. And so, what I discovered over the course of many years of doing this was that 20 years ago, pastors might not have engaged the language of therapy or humility in the same ways that they do now. But they've taken to these things and they'll show up and they'll have the right language. I've consulted on any number of different church abuse cases where the pastor will say all the right words. And in fact, he'll say, well, I know my Enneagram and I've been to my therapist and I've done this deep work in my life and I've looked at my shadows. And yet, uh, fairly quickly in my work, I'll realize that it's pretty empty. It's pretty vacuous.
Mm,
And
mhm,
and so we're seeing this rise of this kind of performative narcissism. And the performance is happening in any number of different areas. I mean, I think it looks like performative truth telling and performative vulnerability and performative empathy at times and
mhm.
performative expertise and performative trauma awareness, as you just hinted at, and performative
Yeah.
outrage. Like we have to be outraged at the thing every day. We have to wake up and there's this new thing. And if we're not properly outraged, which
Mhm,
really discounts real, honest, authentic lament, that might emerge as we do our own work. Performative
mm,
humility, all of these different things. And so I do think again, this is leading me to do this deeper work on character formation, um, because I do think that social media forms us in particular ways, and even our perhaps good desire to come alongside, to be an ally to someone who's going through something can lead to us. I put this out there on social media, in fact, just to see what people would say. And people said they experience performative allyship as well.
mhm.
People just sort of going through the motions because they feel like they have to. And of course, as you and I know from a neuroscience point of view, a lot of this is motivated by anxiety. We're simply operating out of this sort of sympathetic activation in these spaces. And so in our anxiety, we feel like we have to come along. So we feel like we have to say something. We
Mm,
feel like we have to post. We feel like we need to speak authoritatively on something. And it's not born out of slow, deliberate, wise, measured, discerning,
Yeah.
work, thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I think that, like you said, that goes with the first one. It sounds like that the shift where if before a narcissist was authority based, um, then as long as they kept up the masquerade or had the mask of an effective, powerful, decisive
Yeah.
leader, and the organization was growing, then, they wouldn't be found out or they could keep everything under
Yeah.
wraps. But now it sounds like there's this move where it's putting on the mask of social emotional intelligence. Like I know you've talked about like how self-awareness doesn't do the work that it used to, that 20 years ago when you wanted pastors to be self-aware, that usually
Uh,
led to breakthroughs and changes. And now it just is, they're just adopting a certain language, but then the heart work hasn't changed yet.
yeah.
And so they're just kind of taking the new language
Yeah.
and molding another mask, which is, what
Yeah.
hypocrisy is,
Yeah.
wearing masks.
Yeah. Yeah. You and I have talked about this probably over breakfast at some point, but I think for a long time, if you were coming up in our era of pastoral life preparation, we were hearing a lot about self-awareness. And I think now the conversation is shifting to some degree. We're still talking about self-awareness and the importance of it, but there has become a sort of faux self-awareness, this faux vulnerability that I talk about, where people
Mm,
are able to say, I'm this Enneagram and I go to this therapist. I know these things about my life. Um, that masks a deeper dysregulation. So the shift is from self-awareness to self-regulation because
mm,
you
mhm.
might know some things about your story. You might know your Enneagram type, but this performative acting out on social media and other spaces reveals a deeper dysregulation and anxiety
Mm,
that's
mhm.
showing up as this anxious need to have to come alongside others to show that I'm empathetic, or to show that I'm for you, or I'm for this cause, or whatever it might be, or I stand for the truth. And
Yeah.
it's exhausting. I mean, I think that's what I see sometimes when I'm much more disciplined and boundary these days when I do go on social media, but I often think to myself, this is exhausting. If you have to keep up with this, my
Yeah.
goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just saw a comedian who makes a joke about that. Uh, he's like, I think is a millennial, and he talks about our whole generation. We're all anxious, and you'd think that all of us knowing that we're anxious would help out a lot, but really, we're just telling each other that we're anxious so that they have to work around my anxiety rather than me working on becoming less anxious. It's like
Yeah.
we don't want, like, that is
Yeah.
kind of a self awareness that leads to then just not a continued path of growth, right? How do
Yeah.
we acknowledge and then have compassion? Yeah, I was anxious in the moment.
Yeah.
But we can't just keep saying that year after year, moment
Yeah.
after moment. Like at some point, you have to take responsibility and then say, like, I could learn how not to let my anxiety
Yeah.
ruin your day or, this situation.
And because we're
So,
so alone in these spaces, I mean, I think that's the danger, right? Is there would be some accountability, you would think, in the church, or in other spaces. But I often say this, I lead a counseling training program. And I will say to our therapists in training, it's a very isolating vocation. And it's
mm,
very easy because there isn't an accountability, especially if you're in private practice by yourself. You likely don't have a board. So there's no one looking in. Obviously, there's no one looking in on your sessions, right? But it does lead to a kind of isolation. And so we just need to be aware, again, how we're being formed in these ways. Particularly, I mean, all this happens so fast, right? Now you and I know a lot of this began in the early 2000s. When did Facebook emerge? 2005, 2006. But
yeah.
I got on Twitter, I think in '09, '08, '09, but it's been shaping us for a long time now, right? So I have to sometimes extricate myself from the machine and say, what is this doing to me?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Well, let's keep going then. There's three more. You talk about
Yeah.
the shift from apathy in action to now empathy under attack.
Yeah.
Uh, what is going on there?
Yeah. I mean, we could spend a long time here too. And I think just briefly, folks perhaps who are listening know, maybe other folks don't know that, for a number of years now, have been books written on the evils of empathy. Empathy is sin.
Mhm.
It's sort of stunning. I think when there was first book that came out, oh goodness, maybe 2017, 18, blanking on the name now, but I don't know that many of us took it seriously, but as it began showing up more and more in blogs and among people who call themselves Christians, it dawned on me that there's something going on here. And the move for me is apathy in action to empathy under attack, which is to say that for a long time, what I experienced as I was doing this kind of work in the area of abuse and consultation around these things is a kind of apathy among those who were leading from a place of power and often abusive. Now, I think what's happened is that they've sort of switched tactics, you might say, and
Mhm.
they are taking on empathy. They're looking at, I think, many of us who are engaged in, and this is sort of a political thing too. It's caught up
Right.
in a sort of conservative, perhaps, and I don't love this language. I know you don't either, but because too often it's just reductionistic, but more of a conservative sort of attack on those woke liberals, right? Who are just bleeding heart empaths who want to help everyone. Um, and I'm finding this really interesting that there are a group of people who sort of gone on the attack against empathy, which we know is core to narcissism, by the way, right? A lack of
Yeah.
empathy is one of the sort of defining characteristics of narcissism. But as I often say, those of us who teach on empathy often teach that empathy at its best is differentiated, which is to say, this capacity to deeply understand and attune to another person's emotions requires us to not lose ourself
Right.
in another's story, in another's self, right? And so there are boundaries. We do maintain our emotional regulation in the midst of it, and so yeah, it's complicated.
To jump in, I'd almost say that the trouble is to go then to attachment language is there's not like a secure attachment empathy that's being practiced. And so you get one group
Yeah,
that is like the anxiously attached empathy,
yeah,
that is this the all with one another,
yeah.
or the we have to let all the feelings, be validated and affirmed without
That's
any
right.
kind of judgment or any kind of
That's right.
criticism or any kind of discernment or something like that. And then the other side is like against that. Oh, that empathy is weak and wishy-washy. Nothing gets done, and sometimes life is hard. So then you have the avoidant, or what Sid and I call the desert empathy, or
Mhm.
they're against empathy. It's just like that's all. Don't let my facts hurt your feelings, kind of people.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
it's just
that's
like,
good.
well, what we need is like what you said. A self-differentiated kind of empathy that is both with and for people. It
Yeah.
can be with them in their shame or guilt or pain or whatever it is,
Uh,
but then also can be for them in a way that is
yeah.
separated from them
I
and
I
maybe
think
is offering them things they don't necessarily want in that
yeah.
moment, right? So it's just creative. It's more creative.
I think it's tricky in the abuse conversation. I mean, you know how these things sort of shift from one side to the other, right? I think in the abuse conversation, there's been this mantra for a number of years: believe the victim, believe the survivor, right? Believe her
Right.
story. Um, which is to say, pastorally, as you sit with someone who's um, sharing her story of pain, be with her in that and believe her. But
Hmm.
but, and this is a really big but, because I've done a lot of this work over the years. Those of us who do this work are very interested in teasing out the details. Um, and so it's not about some wishy-washy, you told me what your truth is, and I'm just going to believe your truth. Um,
Hmm.
uh, there is this hard work. I mean, I think about the organization Grace, godly response to abuse in uh, church environments. I think it is that when they do investigations, they're trying to tease out the details, right,
Hmm.
and understand what really happened. And there are times, I'm a therapist as well as I was a pastor for a long time. There are times when I'm working with folks who share with me their story of harm, And as we tease things out, we realize that it is more nuanced. And I do think maybe there is
Mhm.
this sense from others that, those of you who do this, you just sort of simply put your rubber stamp and say, and you divide the world into the bad people with power and the good people who have been victimized. And it's just not as simple as that for those of us who are
Mhm.
doing the work every day.
Mm. Well, I want to get to the constructive
Yeah.
stuff. So let's just finish off the last two. You mentioned moving from everything you're saying is great. We could talk for hours, right?
Yeah.
From the anxious, you noted a movement from the anxious narcissist to the emboldened narcissist. Uh, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I do think that when there was a season as we begin talking about narcissism in the church and abuse in the church, that there was this shift to a growing sense. I think many of us had this growing sense that there was a growing sense of accountability within the church. That there were conversations around systems and structures that were harmful, that there was this productive conversation for a few years around the kinds of problems that we were seeing in the church that was leading to some of the fruit that I even mentioned at the outset. Um,
Hmm.
but I think there's been this pendulum swing, this equal and opposite reaction among some who've doubled down and pushed back. I remember, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had, Jeff, particularly after when Narcissism Comes to Church came out, with men in ministry, men who look a lot like me. I would meet with senior pastors, church staffs. We would do Zoom conversations. And at first, there was a bit of a curiosity at best, trepidation at worst. There was a little bit of a sense of, I know what's happening culturally, and we want to do our best to not do those bad things that pastors sometimes do. But,
Hmm.
it would invariably lead within a few minutes to, but why are they canceling us? Why are they going after
Yeah.
us? Um, I think at that point, that's the anxiety that I'm talking about. I think for a while there were pastors and churches, and I think even organizations that were feeling maybe set back on their heels just a little bit defensive. Now it's become they've taken to the offense, and maybe this gets at the
Yeah.
empathy conversation as well. But what we're seeing is a reassertion of what some believe to be the proper hierarchies within the church. I think an entrenchment of hyper masculinity, which would be a longer conversation in and of itself.
Hmm.
Targeting those on the margins. I think the rhetoric of shame and mockery. I mean, you're seeing this, I'm sure, on social media, but we're seeing it from our president. um,
Yeah.
the rhetoric of shame and mockery as acceptable and even righteous,
Right.
um, all reveal what I call the vacuous virtues of control, mastery, and possession. That's the language of Willie James Jennings, um, a theologian who's done some work on these false virtues. But I think those false virtues go line up very well with the kind of narcissism and abuse cultures that we're seeing in the church. They're invariably cultures of control, mastery, and possession, but there's a doubling down on control,
Yeah.
mastering, and possession. I think there's a larger theological conversation to have here about the self-emptying and powerless way of Jesus. I mean, I think this is where we need to
Absolutely.
find our way back to the Gospels, back to the Beatitudes, um, and talk about the way of Jesus. I mean, I think that the season we're just coming out of, Lent, Easter, reminds us of the way of Jesus and how we're invited to show up. It's just stunning to me how many leaders in the church, ecclesial or otherwise, are showing up by doubling down on power, shame, mockery of others.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw a couple articles talking about the shift in our rhetoric from virtue signaling
Mm.
almost to vice signaling. Like, let's just show how nasty we are,
Oh,
that because
interesting.
our cause is so
Yeah.
righteous that, we could just say kind of what needs to be said and or whatever. And it just, even if it looks ugly and horrible. Well, so let's go.
Yeah.
The last one you talked about, I'll just say was from like high bars, of accountability to like the heroic comebacks and how, we live in an era often of
Yeah.
cheap grace, which goes all the way back to um, kind of the algorithm based kind of
Mm.
narcissism, all those things. And so, but let's shift then. How do just really quickly to kind of conclude in the last a couple minutes, how do we kind of start moving toward churches that can be more resilient against this, or that can be places of healing um, in the midst of these kind of dynamics?
Well, I mean, I think it starts with Jesus. I think we've sort of
Amen. Amen.
find our way back to the way of Jesus, living the lowly way of Jesus, the powerless way of Jesus, the self-emptying way of Jesus. Uh, I'm I don't like to become sort of idealistic and say that the early church lived this in a way that we don't live it, but I think there are examples throughout the church
Hmm.
of women and men who've lived this in a way that forgoes the way of power and chooses the way of weakness, the way of humility. Um, I often say to my students that in Augustine, for instance, the word that you'll hear the most is the word humility. It's self-knowledge leads to humility,
Hmm.
not to vulnerability, not to self-protection, right? And
Right.
so what my wondering is how um, this gets to the conversation on character formation. um, I do think that to become someone who lives in these kinds of self-protective ways, who live in what I call sympathetic storm, um, to become someone like that, well, that's an attachment conversation, as you well know, right?
Hmm.
Um, that goes back to an early school of formation, which is to say your family and your early community. So it takes some time for us to become the people who we become. And so I think that we need to have a larger conversation about how we're shaped in the character of Jesus. And that's not a simple recipe that I can offer, right? But we need to cultivate communities of humility and resilience. Perhaps communities that are more embodied, more relational, where there are these, as you and I talk about sometimes, these right brain to right brain connections that allow
Hmm.
us to grow in trust with one another, to speak honestly with one another. This can only happen, I think, in embodied ways, in and through deep connection with one another. And I think a lot of what social media does mitigates against that. It doesn't allow for that eye to eye, right brain to right brain kind of contact that we need. We need nervous systems that are regulated, right? And so for us to actually shift from fight or performance to honest relationship requires us to do the inner work. It allows us to connect with ourselves, with God, and with others. There's a larger conversation that you and I could have about um, how that kind of formation happens inside and outside the church, how it happens in relationships.
Right.
But to me, it gets back to the way of Jesus. It gets back to the Gospels.
Yeah. And living at the speed of Jesus, and
Mhm.
uh, in the sense of taking years to
Yeah.
develop his disciples. I remember I was going through the Ignatian spiritual exercises several years ago, and you're doing these imaginative readings of the life of
Yeah.
Jesus, and you get to the Passion Week, and all the questions were like, how is Jesus meeting you, or how are you participating in Jesus's life? And my whole like the whole several weeks of it was like, I'm not, but that guy Peter, I really identify with. It
Yeah.
was just like all of Peter's
Yeah.
failings, and I wouldn't say that like Peter was like a narcissist necessarily,
Yeah.
or had a disorganized attachment necessarily, but it's possible.
It's possible.
When you start looking at the ways his the extreme movements of faith and lack of faith,
Yeah.
and his declarations of Jesus, and then rebuking Jesus, and then being called Satan because like all, and then especially the Holy Week and the denial, um, and then just seeing how did Jesus deal with Peter, really.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of a roadmap for like if we were just kind of a little both loving but also pretty heavy-handed
Yeah.
Jesus didn't pull any punches with Peter,
No.
but was also like, understanding and
Yeah.
welcoming. And then obviously the restoration after the resurrection of
Yeah.
Peter. But it seems so often like we're more committed to like productivity over like a peaceful character,
Mhm.
or we're more committed to results over
Mhm.
like deep relationships.
Yeah.
These are all kind of systemic
Yeah.
problems in our churches that need to
Yeah.
be addressed for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we're anxious, we can and will sometimes fight back, but if we're chronically anxious, as I was for a number of years, I tell that story in the previous book, chronically dysregulated, we're not so aware when we're living out of fight. We're not so aware of our reactive responses online, and they might even feel to us righteous, and so, I do wonder, in this age in which we're becoming increasingly isolated and lonely, right? How we have the kinds of conversations. Like I'd hope, Jeff, because you and I have developed a relationship, that there'd be times when you come to me and say, I don't know that you're showing up very well these days, in some of what you're posting or how you're reacting. I We've got to cultivate those kinds of conversations as honest, vulnerable, authentic conversations.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can we keep the relationships honest,
Yeah.
truthful, and humble?
Yeah.
Is key. Well, obviously did not solve the narcissism problem in the church
No.
or beyond in these 40 minutes of a podcast, but thank you for just continuing to think about this with us, and with me. And
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll
We'll do it
keep talking
again.
about and
We'll do
exploring.
some
Yeah,
version of
yeah,
this again.
for sure, for sure. Well,
Thanks, man.
for those who don't know your work or where you're based out of, can you just tell people how they can keep track of you?
Yeah,
You
I
just
teach
started a
it.
Substack, I believe, and
Yeah, Substack. I teach at Western Theological Seminary. The Substack is called Sit with Chuck. But my website is chuckdegroat.net, and not hard to find.
all right, those will be in the show notes. Well, thank you so much. Uh, and I think we have a breakfast that's due soon.
Let's do it. See you.